Welcome to our session at Learning Impact 2021 on reinventing high stakes, formative and authentic assessment. We're privileged to have Tian from Texas Education Agency, Peter Leonard from Chicago Public Schools, and Cecilia Rowe from the Maryland State Department of Education. My name is Bruce Umpstead, and I'm the Director of Statewide Engagement here at IMS, and I'm both facilitating and moderating today's session on this hot topic. We're going to be what that means is that I'm going to be monitoring the chat. So if anybody has questions or comments, but I'll also be asking each of our panelists questions, both after their initial presentation, and then we have some discussion questions. That's how we kind of formed this panel conversation today. And with that, we'll get started. I will make a little comment here in that it seems like we really count on our assessment organizations, both at the district and state level, to really kind of be our lighthouse or, the source of truth on how students are progressing in our systems. And looking back over the last 5 to 7 years, there sure has been a lot of changes in our assessment regimes in terms of how we assess students and how we determine the progress that they're making. And then COVID hits, right? So it's not just COVID and the pandemic, which really did shake up all parts of our educational system. But there's been some other changes too that I hope we'll have a chance to discuss how those changes impacted the three programs that we're going to talk about today. But when I was thinking about putting together this panel, I thought really the organizations that we're talking to have really undergone substantial impact from societal changes, environmental changes, and just shifts in our entire system. So it's going to be interesting to see how those impacts have forced changed, invited change, and as the topic is reinventing our assessment programs. With that, I'm going to ask Iris to go first, introduce herself from the Texas Education Agency, tell us a little bit about herself and how she ended up in the position that she's in, and then I have a question for her that I'll ask specifically. Go ahead, Iris.
Thanks, Bruce. My name is Tian. I am currently the Division Director of Assessment at the Texas Education Agency, which is our Department of Education in the great state of Texas. I have been with the agency for about 2.5 years now. Started off my career teaching high school math outside of Houston. I spent a number of years teaching, writing curriculum, supporting coaching new teachers, and then moved over to the private sector for a little bit, doing consulting work, mostly in the education space. So still a lot of work with community-based organizations, foundations, universities, some public-private partnerships, and then came back to the direct Texas education space 2.5 years ago. So my role now, I lead our Texas assessment program, which includes all of our statewide assessments. So in Texas, we have the STAR as our main assessment of the standards that are taught in Texas. And then we also have our English proficiency assessment called TELPAS. And then we have 2 other alternate assessments, TELPAS Alternate and STAR Alternate 2, which assess students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. And so in addition to those mandatory assessments, my team also does a lot of work to support districts throughout the year with assessment. And so we have a number of optional programs, including interims. We recently launched a formative tool. And as a result of COVID, we actually do have now a second year of having a beginning of year diagnostic. That was something that our districts asked of us when COVID hit. So I think one of the things I'll say before we get to the question is that, from our state assessments, yes, a lighthouse, I think Bruce has a good analogy. Even during this big tsunami in that photo, our assessments, both optional and the STAR that we had this previous year, have really helped us to quantify what we already knew, which is that COVID had a huge impact on our student learning, and particularly among some of our historically underserved groups. And so with the start of this school year now, a lot of those challenges still haven't stopped. And as we continue to get funding from the federal government and work to launch new programs to support our districts in accelerated instruction, how we figure out where to target those resources, whether some of the programs we've launched are working, it depends largely on us having accurate, reliable assessment data. And so I am very honored to get to work alongside all the educators and leaders in Texas to support them in getting the data they need to make the decisions they need to make so that we can make sure we're doing everything we possibly can to address the impact of COVID on our students, and also just work towards making sure that every student in Texas is prepared for career, college, or military post-grad.
Great. Thanks again for joining us. So our question for you specifically, and I'll invite our other panelists to comment if they would like after you do, is how are the approaches towards assessment changing at the state level in Texas?
Yes. So what is really interesting in Texas is there was a lot of work already on assessment redesign prior to COVID. And so during the legislative session in 2019, there's one particular bill that was passed that had some pretty exciting and transformative changes to our summative assessment, as well as just interesting things to assessment overall. So from that bill, we are currently in the middle of implementing a redesign of our summative assessment, the STAR. And I think the goal really is to make sure that it is more connected, or as connected as it possibly can be, to instruction. And so we are, historically, we've had an assessment that is mostly multiple choice. We know that teachers, for the most part, are not assessing their students using multiple choice items. And so we are looking at incorporating a lot of new item types, including more constructive response, and just making the assessment look a bit more like what students are seeing in the classroom. We're also getting rid of, so in the past we had standalone writing assessments in certain grade levels. So we had a reading assessment in all grade levels, 3 through 8, and then high school. And then we only had a writing test in grade 4 and grade 7. So that's actually something that we've gotten rid of. No more standalone writing test on its own. And instead we are going to have a reading language arts assessment that assesses both reading and writing, because we know that that is how teachers are teaching. It's how our standards in Texas are written. It's an integrated approach, reading, writing, speaking, and listening in our standards. And so we want to make sure that we're assessing in the same way that our standards are written and that teachers are teaching. The last part of this big redesign is that we're also looking at increasing cross-curricular alignment in our RLA assessments as well. And so we're working to make sure that as many as possible of our RLA passages are actually covering topics that are included in our science standards, our social studies standards. So things that our students will have seen and been exposed to in other content areas. And so while they're not getting assessed on that, the social studies standards, for example, it is something that they're familiar with, and we're hoping to support some of the cross-curricular work that we know many of our schools and districts are doing currently. And so that's this big state summative assessment redesign work that we're doing. At the same time, we're doing a lot of, I think I mentioned earlier, we have interims, we have formatives. So we are also, the bill solidified and said, we must have interims from now on moving forward, which are optional and free for districts. It also had us look at providing more formative support for districts. And so we are, I believe this is our second year with our Texas Formative Assessment Resource, which is an extremely flexible, hoping to really support districts with what they're already doing in the classroom. Just a platform, an item bank, an administration platform to help districts if they need it, to support their formative assessment practices. The last thing I'll say that I think folks have been very interested to hear about is that our bill also had a piece that asked us to put together a pilot to explore whether or not it's possible to replace our current one-time end-of-year state summative assessment with something that happens more regularly throughout the year. Mm-hmm. So we're calling this kind of our through-year assessment pilot, because it is something that we've done a lot of research. We've talked to a bunch of folks. We don't know yet if this is possible. We don't know, the data is not out there yet to say whether this is going to be a feasible replacement for the summative, but we are looking at piloting to see, can we get to a valid comparable result that could potentially give, more frequent information to districts, to educators, potentially to parents, and also give kids more opportunities throughout the year, so it doesn't depend so much on one day. So a lot of big changes happening in Texas. As I think many folks know, it takes years and years to develop assessments. And so a lot of this we started working on 2 years ago, continue to work on now. And a lot of the work that we're doing is slated to launch in our upcoming school year. So 2022, 2023 is when a lot of these exciting changes are happening. And we still have a good amount of work to do to reach that goal.
Did the legislature actually provide you with funding for these extra activities?
Yes, they did. I think many folks in assessment know, a lot of the reason why assessments have been multiple choice for so long is because it is the cheapest test to build. And so for us to have more open-ended constructive response items, we did need some funding to be able to do that.
Interesting. Well, we'll definitely want to use this as context when we get to our discussion questions. Thank you for sharing. We do have Peter Leonard here. He's the Executive Director of Student Assessment at Chicago Public Schools. Peter, would you like to introduce yourself, your position, and some of the things you're working on, and then we'll ask you your specific question.
Sure. Thanks, Bruce. Good afternoon, everybody. As Bruce shared, my name is Peter Leonard. I'm the Executive Director of Student Assessment in the Office of Teaching and Learning for Chicago Public Schools, the third largest district in the country. I've been with CPS for 8 years, all with the Department of Student Assessment, leading it for the past 5. I'm a native Philadelphian, so an East Coaster, and I spent my time teaching in Florida, but I've really become anchored in the Midwest. We really frame our department's role for empowering all stakeholders with high quality evidence of student learning that allow them to take their actions that contribute to access, learning, opportunity, and achievement for all students. We do that partially through the operations, policy, and administrations of our large-scale assessments, national assessments like NAEP, state-required assessments in Illinois, as well as some of our high-stakes assessments within the district. We're launching a high school admissions test this year, and we have our algebra exit exam. But then we also work on many of our formative programs, so either interim or benchmark assessments, as well as technologies, tools, professional learning, that emphasizes formative assessment practice and really bringing assessment closer to the learning in the pre-K through 12 continuum in our district.
Right. Glad to have you here.
Glad to be here.
You'll be presenting at 3 p.m. Eastern with your counterpart on the Skyline project, so I'm excited about that. Let me ask you this question. How has CPS or Chicago Public Schools leveraged the current disruption to reimagine assessment in your district?
I think everybody on here really has experienced that significant disruptions do provide opportunities for innovation. It's also interesting being on here with some state colleagues, because when there's innovation being taken at multiple levels, one of the processes is making sense of and navigating change across multiple levels to achieve coherence. And that's really been our focus in leveraging this disruption, is working towards assessment coherence across our district. So we talk a lot in CPS about our balanced assessment systems, helping to build the knowledge understanding around different assessments having different purposes and uses, and helping teams build plans around the implementation of particular assessments and the use of those, so the right people are having access to the right information at the right time to take kind of defensible actions based on the way those assessments have been created. And our coherence is really trying to pull together what we have from the state in terms of summative assessments, along with the curriculum connected assessments that we're providing via Skyline, which I'll talk more about this afternoon, and maybe weave into some of our other questions that you're going to ask Bruce, as well as some new partnerships around assessments across the K-12 space for screening, diagnostic, and progress monitoring assessments, disconnected from accountability, but solely in place at no cost to schools to help them implement their instructional programs and MTSS systems. So because we've had such a dearth of information about all of our students, and in Chicago this fall is the first time we are fully back 5-day in person for all students, we really want to equip our families, our teachers, and our school leaders with information that allows them to, one, understand where students are, but then take that acceleration focus and acceleration approach to how we move our students forward. And so that's a combination. So just to summarize, we have a new curriculum, set of a curriculum embedded assessments with Skyline. We have new partnerships for assessment tools disconnected from accountability, connected to MTSS programs. And we are launching a district-wide learning cycle around the idea of reimagining assessment with this emphasis on coherence and on bringing assessment closer to the learning.
Awesome. Thank you.
Peter, can I ask a follow-up question?
Of course.
How are you developing this learning cycle? Because I think one of the things we're really thinking about is how to support districts and support, principals and teachers in being able to plan for, I think what you're describing as assessment's coherence. And we've gotten some requests from folks asking for, more specific training on assessment literacy and the different uses and all that. So wondering, I guess, your source or, how you came up with the learning cycle that you all have now.
Sure. Appreciate the question, Iris. Thank you. So there's some CPS context. We have 517 district managed schools. We have about 642 schools total. Our schools create assessment plans each spring for the following fall. So our collective bargaining agreement stipulates what assessments can be considered required versus which are considered additional. So we work with our school leaders every spring on kind of assessment literacy and understanding balanced assessment systems as they try to build a plan and implement it. The long story short there, though, is that there is a significant amount of variability school by school in terms of what their assessment programs look like through the year. And so to build a learning cycle anchored in reimagining assessment, it's needed, like everything that we do, we have to play with what we hold tight and what we hold loose. But it's been a collaboration from the Office of Teaching and Learning, as well as our network support team, who oversees different collections of schools across networks in the district. We've organized these learning cycles so that school teams can apply them in their local context. So we had an ILT Institute, a common structure within Chicago Public Schools, our instructional leadership teams. We launched this learning cycle via an ILT Institute in August, where we had a little over 320 school ILT teams participate, which was an introduction to learning cycles as a structure, as well as some foundational learning around assessment coherence with breakout sessions on particular themes for the year. If you're a school who's going to go deeper on curriculum embedded assessments, where a school is going to go deeper on use of screening, diagnostic, and progress monitoring assessments for tiered supports, so that school teams had a few different lanes that they could then explore. Through the year, for our high schools, we operate a summit structure where we do direct 3 times a year learning with our high school teams. Elementary school needs to be a little more flexible since we have many more elementary schools, and we'll be facilitating and supporting those learning cycles via our network teams who are doing some of the upstream planning and learning with us.
Thanks.
Cool.
Yeah.
Helpful. And the third member of our team is Cecilia Rowe with the Maryland State Department of Education. Cecilia, do you want to introduce yourself, explain your position, because you're not formally in the assessment division there at the department, and then I'll ask you a question that we worked on together.
Yes, thank you, Bruce. I am the Director of Instructional Assessment, which is actually part of the Curriculum Division within the Maryland State Department of Education. I also oversee professional learning, Title II, and English Language Arts, but my main role, obviously, for today is the instructional assessment piece. I came from Baltimore County Public Schools. I was in Baltimore County for 34 years before moving to the State Department. I've been at the State Department for about 10 years now, in this same role the entire time. And when I was in Baltimore County Public Schools, I got into education because I wanted to teach and I wanted to be with the kids. And I was determined I was never going to move out of the classroom. You see how well that worked out. But I really did stay in the classroom a long, long time. I had a variety of school-based teacher kind of leadership kind of positions, department chair, team leader, reading specialist, just a variety of things before I kind of gave into the forcing. And when I left Baltimore County Public Schools, I was actually head of secondary English for Baltimore County. And then Race to the Top happened and Common Core happened, and I was really excited about the change and wanted to move to the State Department and be part of that. So that's kind of how I ended up here. The instructional assessment piece of my work is, I got a lot of, I mean, really honestly, all parts of my job have a lot of my passion, but this really has a lot of my passion too, because it's that instructional assessment that guides those individual needs of those students along the way that teachers need to use to adapt student instruction to meet their needs. And without that, we're never going to have true equity. So I have a lot of passion for what I do, and I love what I do, and I hopefully won't be ending this piece of my life anytime soon.
Right. Well, thanks for joining us today. I know when we started planning this call, I talked with you, and you helped me start to understand the difference between screening, diagnostic, and formative assessment. And I wanted to have a better understanding of your understanding of these three different types of assessment and how they impact your work that you're doing in Maryland.
Thank you, Bruce. So the assessment division, and there is an assistant superintendent who oversees that division, oversees the state assessments. And I am the liaison in my position with the Division of Curriculum. I am the liaison with that division. Most of what I do is, as the title states, instructional assessment. So screening would be the first piece of that. Screening is a very brief, simple assessment process. The word brief is the most important part of that description. And it helps teachers identify students who are at risk for not meeting grade level learning goals and benchmarks. So basically, it identifies students who could be at risk. Doesn't necessarily say they are at risk, but they're identifying them as possibly being at risk for grade level achievement. So if you kind of think about an eye doctor and going to an eye doctor, you use that wall chart to get a quick assessment of your vision. You look at the wall, and that doctor can tell by you looking at that wall chart whether you're nearsighted, whether you're farsighted. It gives him that quick assessment that you could be at risk to have vision problems. So I kind of think of screening that way. It's a very brief, simple assessment that kind of gives that quick view for the teacher to know where the student's needs are and to know that the student could be at risk, and that the teacher may need to give additional supplemental instruction to that student in order to deal with those factors. It does have some diagnostic properties, but not as much as a diagnostic assessment. So the diagnostic assessment is a little bit longer than a screening. A screening is meant to be brief, and it uses generally multiple measures and reports on students' strengths and needs in specific skill areas, so that teachers can provide instruction that truly addresses those learning needs that their students have, specific to their needs. So if I go back to that eye doctor analogy, after the patient reads that eye chart, if the doctor detects any kind of issues with the patient's eyesight from the eye chart, the doctor will at that point know if the patient either is nearsighted or farsighted, and will then turn to that complex eye machine that has all the variety of lenses to get a more complete picture of the patient's sight and actually to give the appropriate prescription to meet the patient's needs in giving them the prescription for the eyeglasses. So similarly, the diagnostic does that as well. It goes deeper than the screener, and it detects more comprehensive data on the needs of the student, so that the teacher can actually give the supplemental instruction that the student needs to meet their deficits. And of course, that could include MTSS. I mean, it could just be in-class kinds of remediation that the teacher can do in class with regrouping and things like that. Or it could actually be moving the student to a higher tier, using more of a multi-tiered system of support. But the diagnostic can give you that more in-depth analysis than a screener would give you. And in either case, when you're determining the prescription, if you're talking about the eyeglasses, to treat the student's specific needs, the school should definitely include multiple measures. So part of that whole diagnostic assessment system should also include screening. It should also include classroom observations. It should include progress monitoring. It should include multiple sources of data, so that you're constantly checking to see if you're truly meeting the student's needs, and if what you're doing with the supplemental instruction isn't meeting their needs, it's going to show up. And then you can change that supplemental instruction to meet their needs. So it needs to be ongoing. It's not just a give and stop one time only kind of thing. Both screeners and diagnostic assessments should be ongoing throughout the year. And then the final piece that Bruce asked me to talk about was formative assessment. Maryland has really been at the forefront of formative assessment for a number of years. This Chief Counsel of State School Officers, CCSSO, uses our Maryland model a lot in order to do presentations and things at their collaboratives, at their workshops. And other states have actually taken a lot of the work that we've done with formative assessment and they've modeled it. We call it FAME, Formative Assessment for Maryland Educators. And basically, formative assessment, unlike diagnostic assessments, unlike screenings, and unlike state assessments, is not an item bank. And that's a misconception that a lot of people make a lot. There is no bank of items, such as you have in these other assessment systems. It's more of a process. It's a planned ongoing process used by students and teachers to elicit and find evidence of students' learning and to improve student understanding of intended learning outcomes and to support those students right at the point of instruction and at the point of greatest need. And also is to help students become self-directed learners, to actually see and be able to assess their own weaknesses and where they need additional strength and they need additional support. There are some basic things that should be included in formative assessment, things like learning goals and success criteria, analyzing evidence of student thinking, providing feedback to the students, encouraging students in self-assessment and peer feedback, and using evidence and feedback to adjust learning strategies and goals and next instructional steps. So you can see formative assessment is a process, whereas diagnostic assessment, screenings, and also state assessments are not really part of a process, although diagnostic assessments do have a process embedded, but it's a different type of process rather than an ongoing day-to-day process as you have in formative assessments.
Interesting. Thank you for helping at least me understand that. Hoping that people that we're streaming to can appreciate that as well. We're right on track to move into our discussion, panel discussion. So
Bruce, if you wouldn't mind, I would have loved to jump in really quick because Cecilia, I think that framing is awesome and very helpful because we've been struggling a lot with at the state level. You know, formative assessment, the way you described it, has to be so tight knit with instructional materials, with what's actually being taught. And at the state level, there isn't much we can do because, you know, at the district level, at school, even at the teacher level, everyone is kind of at a different place. And so when we talk about state formative assessment resources, we're working really hard to say, you know, for us, it's formative in terms of if you view the instructional cycle as the school year. But really, what we're supporting with our formative assessment resource are more like unit summonings, which I think has been difficult to kind of work with different people to figure out how we can communicate that clearly, because it really isn't meant like, yes, formative is not an item bank. And so even though we provide an item bank as a resource, this is not supposed to be, great, use this is your formative assessment. And so what we're really working on launch this resource is how do we make sure that it doesn't come across the wrong way as, hey, districts, you know, adopt this and this is what your formative assessment is, because it absolutely is not. And so I really appreciate, I think, your framing and your definition there, because it is something that we hear a lot, and we're trying really hard to make sure that as we do launch these supports, we don't accidentally communicate the wrong thing, that what we are providing is in fact, you know, a formative assessment period.
Thank you, Iris, and thank you also, because I'd like to add, you know, basically what we do from the state level. I didn't talk about that, and I didn't think about that until you just said what you said. But what we do on the state level to support schools is we offer courses. I actually have a formative assessment team that works, an instructional assessment team that works for me. We provide virtual courses as well as face-to-face support to schools. We see it as a collaborative process where teachers come together, they look at the data, they help each other. It involves classroom observation, peer observation from a teacher perspective as well. And we really do a lot to try to make the schools realize that it is a process. And so the support we give is more in training the teachers and how to use formative assessment with fidelity, how to analyze the data, how to empower the students to self-assess, those kinds of things. And our courses, we actually have one that we've been running probably for the last 5 years, which is our FAME course. But now, and it was actually written in collaboration with Umpstead, not that I'm trying to give a plug to Umpstead, but Now we're actually working with Umpstead again to revise it because we have a lot of data behind what we've done over the last several years. And we're actually creating like a 2.0 version where we're emphasizing the student agency part of formative assessment. And that's going to be another course. So we're really excited about what we do and how it's evolving.
Great.
I'd like to make it a connection here, and I really appreciate this, Cecilia. And I'm sure, right, it's intentional that that doesn't say formative assessments, right? It's the idea that it's a process and that assessments themselves aren't formative or summative, but their uses are formative and summative. I think I would love to make some connections also. We have a small assessment for learning team within my department, and we have a network session on Wednesday focusing on eliciting evidence of student learning and really tapping into what you were talking about, that development of assessment capable learners, and that when we're really taking this to its fullest extent, that we are really empowering students with that agency to, like you said, with the success criteria, to know where they're going, to know where they are, and to be partners in closing that gap.
So in our discussion section, I wanted to make sure that we better understood what the drivers of change in your programs are. Many of you, all three of you, seem to be embracing changes and putting changes in place that started before the pandemic. And we do have a question later about the pandemic, but I wanted to have a better understanding of maybe some of the things that are impacting your assessment programs from outside. Who wants to go first? There's no right answer.
I'll go first.
Okay.
I ended, so I guess I'll go first.
Okay.
Well, obviously right now, COVID is a huge driver of change, but I know you do have a COVID question later on that you're going to ask us, so I won't go into depth about that. But our state legislature has been a huge driver of change for us because our state legislature has never in the past really done a whole lot with education until like maybe the last 4 or 5 years under Governor Hogan's purview. It's not really his purview, that's the wrong word, but under his leadership in the state. And the state legislature got involved, I think more because we have a Republican governor and we have a Democratic state legislature, and so the state legislator felt like they needed to get more involved. And I could be wrong about that, but that's what it felt like with the timing and everything of when the state legislature started getting more involved. And they passed a lot of education laws over the past 4 or 5 years. And the biggest ones they passed was right before COVID, called the Blueprint for Maryland's Future. Lots and lots of education reform, a lot of research over several years went into it, a lot of different, divided up into different task force that met and reviewed the legislature, reviewed the research, and actually called in different experts to testify and things like that, and wrote this blueprint, this law, as a result of all that research that they did. And then COVID happened, and that kind of went on pause. But now it's gaining speed again. And one of the things that they've done as well that's really influenced assessment in the last several years is in 2013, they passed legislature for a CCR designation for students to graduate. It doesn't impact their ability to graduate, CCR meaning college and career readiness designation. It just says that they are college and career ready. So that legislation that was passed in 2013 required Maryland to make sure that they assess students and give them a CCR designation or not before they graduate, and the assessment had to happen at the end of grade 11. This new blueprint legislation actually moves that down to grade 10 because they want 2 more years for students who aren't college and career ready or just do not appear to be at risk for not being college and career ready, to have that time to be able to have the instruction needed to get them there. So that's been a huge driver of change for Maryland is our state legislation. And we now have a new superintendent, and he's only been here since July, very energetic, very dynamic, very in support of the blueprint, making a lot of changes. And I always felt like, which is part of the reason I went to MSE during the Common Core Race to the Top era, is I've always found change to be invigorating and motivating. And so I think, you know, his coming as well is making huge changes. And I think that they are going to take us in the right direction. They're going to be research-based, and we're going to be in a good place. And I think we are in a good place, but we'll be in a better place.
Peter, what's driving some of the changes inside of Chicago related to your assessment program?
Sure. I think the big one I'll highlight is Skyline. So Skyline is the district's, just this summer, we released our district's digital culturally responsive curricula called Skyline. And that includes lessons, additional resources, assessments, pacing guides, et cetera, for pre-K through 12th grade in literacy, math, science, social science, world languages, Spanish and French, with a few other disciplines coming down the line. We looked at the curriculum that was out there and realized that there was not curriculum available that was high quality, culturally responsive, and connected to Chicago in a way that would truly deliver the types of learning experiences that we think all students deserve. And so we engaged in a co-design process with a series of partners over the last couple of years, and anchored in IMS global standards to achieve digital interoperability. And we just launched in July. And so now teachers across the city are able to opt into the use of Skyline at no cost. They're able to get some of the hard copy resources that may come along with it. But the curriculum itself is digital. The lessons and materials are anchored in Safari Montage. Our assessments are delivered through our district assessment system called Checkpoint, which is Illuminate Education's school city engine. Google Classroom operates as our kind of de facto LMS. And we're really excited now to have curriculum connected assessments at the lesson, unit, and interim level for all of these design sessions. As Iris talked about, it is really hard to do assessment literacy work at a conceptual level without connecting to the things students are learning day in and day out. So we're excited to really pair that. We're not just talking about assessments allow you to make day-to-day instructional decisions, but hey, based on UDIN assessment 4 in the science grade 6 curriculum, what are the common misconceptions that you may see? Based on the patterns that might come out from this lesson assessment, what are the most likely moves you might need to make tomorrow? So we really see the curriculum and assessment as an additional infrastructure to do the deeper learning across and alongside our educators. So we just launched 5,800 teachers opted in for year one, and we're really on a learning journey together.
Yeah, I'm excited about our panel conversation later today with the really the user experience director for Chicago Public too. So we're going to have that conversation at 3 p.m. Eastern. We are starting to run close on time, so I wanted to make sure we ask Iris this question. What insights have you gained so far in the changes that are taking place in your system?
Yeah, I think I would echo, I think, a lot of what we've already talked about today, which is that our work right now is a lot of implementing legislative requirements and bills and just making sure that we're meeting our both federal and state requirements for assessing students across Texas. But I think while we are working to continuously improve, what our summative assessment looks like, I think we're finding out that some of what is really driving these changes is less, we should do this to our summative assessment, but more, we're currently not using our summative assessment the way that a summative assessment should be used. And, the fix to that is not necessarily changing the summative assessment. It's how do we clarify for all decision makers and all consumers of the data, this is what a summative assessment is supposed to do. We have to do it for certain reasons. There's reasons why it's very important, and because it is really one of our only sources of it's comparable yearly, it's comparable across districts, it's comparable. So there's a need for that data, but it cannot replace or even try to support some of the purposes of formative assessment, for example. And I think that what we're really trying to do now and listening to a lot of our stakeholders for what would be helpful for them is thinking about how we can better communicate. This is our summative assessment. Here's how it's designed. Here's how it's meant to be used. And if you try to use it for a formative purpose, it's not going to work because that's not the way it's been designed to work. And so along with, I think, our continued efforts to look at what are innovative models of summative assessments, I think we're also trying to think more intentionally about how we can better communicate and train and provide supports around the different types of assessment, the different use cases of assessment data, and help everyone, I think a lot of different folks in different positions across the state use this or be more aware of the different types and how the intended purpose of them, rather than necessarily making changes to the assessment itself for a purpose that it wasn't intended to serve. So that I think is what I would say is a big, not surprising, but I think it's been interesting to hear from many different folks, the realization that some of it might be less about actually changes to the assessment itself.
Yeah. Actually, that word intentionality is something I think I've gleaned from prepping for this call, talking to each of you, is it seems like our assessment programs are becoming much more intentional at the outcomes they're trying to achieve. I think it is going to always be a challenge to get, especially the higher the policymaker, to use and better understand the use of the summative assessment in the overall program. I want to thank each of you for presenting today. I think you gave us really interesting perspectives, and it'll be interesting to see how assessment continues to grow and change. And I don't know, just leaving here makes me feel a lot more optimistic that our assessment organizations understand the changes that are going on and are changing to meet those demands. So again, thank you for your time today, and just encourage you to log into some of these other sessions. I've got one at 2 on the Broward Open CLR system. They're using another standard of ours to kind of track competency in algebra. They're working with the algebra project. That's next for me. And then at 3 p.m. we have Chicago talking about Skyline and that kind of balanced tension between user experience and assessment. So excited to be part of that too. So thank you again, and have a great rest of your Monday.